Get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Mills. I'm the president of the National Bureau of Asian Research. Flew in from Seattle last night and glad to be here in Washington, D.C. This is a good crowd for this afternoon, so I'm pleased to have you all here. Today's event marks the publication of our recent special report, Mapping China's Strategic Space. It's the latest one at NBR, authored by Nadège Roland, who's our Distinguished Fellow in China Studies. And it's a fantastic piece of writing, so I encourage you to take the time to read it in detail. The report is a culmination of 2 years of groundbreaking research that scholars have undertaken, trying to understand China's strategic ambitions, and really trying to understand how the Chinese elites think about the space around the democracy and how it plays into their achievement of their objectives. At the outset, I do want to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for funding this effort. This has been an intensive effort, required an important grant for us to be able to do. Carnegie is a critical fund for relevant research on Asia studies today. So as I mentioned, the main question we were trying to understand with this report was how does China think about its strategic space? Not just geographically the physical space, the territories around China, whether these are contested claims to the South China Sea or the East China Sea, whether it's the claim to unify with Taiwan, whether it's the dispute with India on the border of the Himalayas. But what are the ambitions beyond that? What are the spaces that the Chinese government feels it needs to secure in various ways in order to achieve its strategic objectives? These include space, these include the deep seas, these include polar regions. And the study, as you'll hear, and we'll get to discussion this afternoon, the Chinese government came to its conclusions today, and then forward to try and imagine and sort of understand what signposts we should be looking for to determine where that might go. You'll hear from the expert speakers, those ambitions are very far-ranging. About this as well. This is not a typical quick take think tank report on an issue of today, China's strategic ambitions. This is a deep dive, intellectually rigorous assessment of where Chinese thinking has come from and where it might be going. Nadège is the lead author, but she's been the lead of a team of more than 20 scholars who contributed important language and research to this end. The report is there's a dedicated website, strategicspace.nbr.org, where we have a full range of short-form essays, podcasts, video footage, maps, infographics, and really try and tell the story. And so I encourage you to spend some time looking at this. In terms of our format this afternoon, my colleague Alison Solwinski, who's our Vice President for Research, is going to moderate a discussion with Mark Lambert, our keynote remarks here from the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for China and Taiwan. We're delighted that Mark's carved out some time from his busy schedule to join us today. Then we'll have a panel discussion with Nadège Roland, Jackie Deal, Nicole Hurley, and Alan Freeberg, who will present some key findings from the report, and really dig deeper and offer some conclusions and discuss the implications of that. So I thank them, all of them, for taking time to contribute to the discussion today. I thank the 20 plus other authors who contributed. I see a few of you in the room here today, so thanks for making time to be part of this session. Special thanks to Louis Martin Desian, who's CI Geography. He's the designer who created a lot of the maps and the infographics you can see on the website and you can see in the hard copy report. And then briefly, my colleagues Audrey, Jeremy, and many others who left NBR because the project has taken over 2 years to contribute to various aspects of research. Thank you all for your hard work to make this possible. With that, finish my remarks and invite Ali and Mark to come up to the project.
Thanks so much, Michael. As Michael kindly noted, my name is Ali Swinsky. I'm the Vice President for Research at NBR. And today I have the great privilege of introducing our keynote speaker, State Department's China Coordinator and Deputy Assistant Secretary Mark Lambert. Deputy Assistant Secretary Lambert serves as the State Department's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for China and Taiwan within the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He assumed this position in September of 2023. Over the last decade, Mr. Lambert has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Japan, Korea, Mongolia, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands, as Special Envoy for North Korean Affairs, as director for the Office of Korean Affairs and as political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Hanoi. He has also served in Beijing, most recently managing U.S. political military affairs with China. So you can tell we have really an extensive set of experiences and deep background to draw on here today. The VP Assistant Secretary Lambert has been recognized throughout his career for his service and accomplishments. Among other accolades, he's been named State Department's Human Rights Officer of the Year and has been awarded for his work in strengthening the U.S.-Vietnam relationship, for his voluntary efforts responding to the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, for helping shape the U.S. response to the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and for his efforts to resolve the 2001 B-3 crisis involving a U.S. naval aircraft forced down on China's Hainan Island. So again, we're really pleased to have his knowledge and experience to shed some insights and light on how the United States is thinking about and approaching its relationship with Taiwan and China, and on several of the key issues that the report touches on, and we'll hear further about later. So with that, I will turn it over to December for some remarks, and then after he concludes, we'll have a moderated Q&A.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about what I think is a very relevant topic, mapping China's strategic space. And I like the concept behind this research because we find that many of the activities that China is pursuing in the area around its periphery are affecting China's activities in other parts of the world. And perhaps some more detail. I'd also like to thank Michael Wills for his leadership in putting this together. Thank you for the. I know you get a lot of attention from the State Department. I know Kurt Campbell was just here talking about Mike Ring's new book. I saw Mike recently when I was in Sydney, and he's enjoying life in Australia. I'd also like to share informally our views on how we see China looking at its strategic space in the periphery around the area. I may bleed over into other parts of the world because I do think that is happening right now. First, I'd like to start, though, with a trip a little bit down memory lane, going back to the start of the Biden administration, when under the president's national security strategy, the president outlined some key observations. While acknowledging that we have serious concerns with Russia, with Venezuela, with Iran, and other actors, the national security strategy made it very clear there's one country on earth with the diplomatic, the economic, fundamentally reshape the post-World War II order, and that's the PRC. And in order to face that challenge, we needed to do diplomacy and conduct other aspects of American policy in a different way. The office that I'm pleased to lead, the Office of China Coordinations, aka China House, is Secretary Blinken's response to that. So as part of our analysis of what we've seen the Chinese doing, we've noticed a number of things in no particular order. The Chinese have made it a priority to catch up to and surpass the United States in a number of key technologies: intelligence, quantum computing, semiconductors, biotech. And all of these have obvious military ramifications. We've made it very clear that we are not going to sit by idly and see the Chinese weaponize these technologies and use them to kill Americans or our allies. We've seen the Chinese pursue the largest military buildup in its history. We've seen the Chinese become far more repressive at home and abroad. You see the PRC not allowing any type of public discussion of religious freedom, freedom of expression. Xinjiang has become a lockdown state. You look at what's happened in Hong Kong. You look at what's happened to the ability of Tibetans to express themselves. And you look at how Han Chinese across the country have been treated with a lot of the new laws, including Thanksgiving. This is extremely concerning. And then we're looking at a far more assertive PRC in the waters around it. Obviously in the South China Sea, where for a number of years we've seen the Chinese pushing an agenda, pushing their version of international law, which is not conforming with any type of This has manifested itself most recently in their standoff with the Philippines, but in the past, you've seen it in Vietnam, you've seen them ignoring both Malaysian and Indonesian claims in the South China Sea. You see it with the salami slice tactics that the PRC is undertaking in the Taiwan Strait. Right now, you've seen activities around Jinmen Island and other things that have caused us deep concern. A lot of rules of the road that we thought we had with the PRC or that the Taiwanese thought they had with the PRC are not being observed anymore. You see it around the Sinco. I would argue that we need to watch closely the Yellow Sea, and we need to watch more closely the Indian Ocean, because we're seeing a new definition of territorial integrity and territorial sovereignty, and acting like you are sovereign in the waters, not just immediately around the PRC, but further afield. The Chinese are combining all assets of their power, economic, diplomatic, and political, in pressing their objective around their country. We've seen them undermine the international rules-based order. We can talk a little bit more about how they've been doing that in international relations for some time. But we also see what they're doing with economic coercion. A number of countries in the immediate periphery around China have been on, have felt this ire. Korea with the deployment of our THAAD missile system a few years back. Japan, of course, cut off from rare earths. You've seen Taiwan repeatedly being subjected to economic coercion. The Philippines repeatedly with their agricultural exports. Vietnam with their tourism sector and their economic exports. Countries as far afield as Palau are feeling this as well, and Australia with their exports of wine and lobster tails and other types of high-end goods. The PRC's militarization of these disputed outposts in the South China Sea, its willingness to use coercion and intimidation, as we saw any of you geeked out in 60 Minutes yesterday, along with other provocative actions undertaken to enforce its expansive and unlawful maritime claims, undermine the peace and security of the region. I know I'm speaking to a sophisticated audience, but you all know we take great pains to talk about just how important these bodies of water are. The amount of trade that transits through the South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca, the Taiwan Strait, very, very important for all global commerce, including from Europe. When Russia invaded the Ukraine, ripples were felt in Argentina, where the Argentine economy was affected tremendously. If there were similar sorts of tactics, not even military, but coercive tactics applied towards Taiwan, estimates range from 2 to 10 trillion US dollars of damage to global trade. That gets people's attention. So the United States remains committed to work with our like-minded in helping to push back at these activities. You've seen, after we did our national security strategy, a number of countries, both in East Asia and in Europe, came up with their own national security strategies and talked about our desire to work together in concert to manage these challenges. And let me underscore how we see this. The bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing has been in a very, very difficult strait. We have a desire to see the competitive nature of our competition be managed, and not to let that competition spiral out of control into conflict. And so when President Biden hosted President Xi Jinping in California last November, the goal was to find some ways to leaven this competitive relationship, fully recognizing that these issues that separate us, China's support for the Russian war effort in Ukraine, this China being determined to become the global leader in these emerging technologies, China's increasing willingness to use economic coercion. These problems are not going to go away, but we would like to find some ways to stop it from just spiraling out of control. So we have had some modest successes. There have been talks between American experts and Chinese experts going after the precursor chemicals that go into fentanyl production. It has probably affected every man and woman in this room. This is a curse that is the biggest killer of Americans ages 19 to 49 in the States. And frankly, our assessment is the Chinese have been cooperating. We're looking at military to military cooperation. I have worked on this issue for a number of years in my career. It is very worrisome, the fact that we don't have a common set of rules of the road for our aircraft, for our ships. We've seen repeatedly throughout our country's history what happens when things bump into each other. And so we have been grateful that our operators, our working level military officers have had meaningful exchanges with their Chinese counterparts. Now, I don't want to oversell this. We've not resolved our disagreements, but at least we're talking about ways to work together. There is a false narrative I run into when I travel around the world that suggests that the United States wants countries to choose between having an economic relationship with Beijing or with Washington. This is not true. China is the United States' third largest trading partner. We did over $750 billion worth of trade with PRC last year. What we're asking, though, as you've seen with the president's statements, with Secretary Blinken's statements, and with others, is that trade be responsible and that trade support our overarching objectives. Let me talk for a moment about Taiwan. For years, we have tried to raise an understanding, both in our own country and abroad, about Taiwan's unique role as a vibrant democracy. And some people in some countries do care about that. But I think it really has been helpful for us to see the economic miracle that Taiwan has become. Taiwan is the United States' 9th largest trader. We see the types of commodities that Taiwan makes, and frankly, it makes the 21st century possible. Looking at this investment in your own country and elsewhere is showing the links that an increasing number of countries have with stability in the Taiwan Strait. I referred to earlier about the potential damage to global prosperity if there were some type of hard gray zone activities in the Taiwan Strait. That gets people's attention. But I think it's also encouraging other countries around the world to talk about the desire that any type of difference Beijing has with Taipei be managed responsibly. We continue to press for Taiwan's meaningful participation in international organizations. Our country has a one China policy. It's not a one China principle. We'll go into that later. One China policy, and it has served our country well for decades now. We are not about to flip and recognize Taipei over Beijing. Nonetheless, we do see the utility of Taiwan's meaningful participation in United Nations bodies where public health and public safety is paramount. For example, the World Health Organization, World Health Assembly, up in Montreal at the International Civil Aviation Organization. Each of us is safer if Taiwan's scientists, if Taiwan's civil aviation experts are allowed to share their experiences and share their ideas with counterparts in order to make us more secure from pandemics and other diseases, or in order to make the airs above us safer. I could talk at length about efforts the PRC has been taking to try to cut off Taiwan's space. Time won't allow me to go into that detail unless you're morbidly curious and ask about this go forward. But in wrapping up my formal remarks, what I would like to say is, while we are committed to stand up for U.S. principles and to push back at what we see as very aggressive behavior, both on the water, the air surrounding China, we're also committed to having dialogue with China. You've seen that since the California summit, Secretary Blinken has engaged regularly with Wang Yi. Wang Yi wears two hats. He's both their foreign minister and he's Jake Sullivan's counterpart. So Jake Sullivan was just in Beijing and had a good series of conversations there. Secretary Austin has talked with his Chinese counterpart, Secretary Raimondo, Secretary Yellen, and both have engaged. Committed to try to manage this very, very difficult relationship because it's so important, because the stakes are so high. So getting to the mapping China's strategic space, I get frustrated at times because you can't swing a cat in this town without finding a China expert. And so often they're saying you're fighting the Cold War wrong. We did this with the Soviet Union, you're doing that with the Soviet Union. And while I think there are analogies from the Cold War and the Soviet experience, there are many, many differences. And one of this is mapping the space. And while the Soviet Union was was intent on trying to create a lot of Soviet units. We don't see the Chinese doing that. We see the Chinese trying to set up an area of influence, and that is very different. I think if you read the Chinese, what the Chinese leaders say about China, that is a huge difference. Also, it should go without saying, we didn't have nearly the economic linkage with the Soviet Union when we were kids that we have with the PRC. This is not going to change. The second largest economy on earth, we're the first largest economy on earth. They have a hugely important tech sector, as do we. We're going to have to figure out ways to manage this and use tools from the economic and trade toolbox that we had before, which is why so much of our diplomacy with the countries in and around East Asia is trying to figure out what China's objectives are, what China's strategy is in East Asia and the Pacific, so that we can figure out, do we care about this? Do we not care about this? And then looking further abroad, and that's why I think that the work that's being done here is going to help us as we look at other parts of the world. What lessons are the Chinese using in the areas that immediately surround the PRC that they're applying elsewhere? I think we're seeing some of this in human space, or but what other things are we seeing in UN conventional law? See, what other things are we seeing on biotechnology? What other things are we seeing on agricultural technology and agriculture exports? What other things are we seeing on using trade and tourism as a cudgel to coerce others into doing it? So with that as my formal discussion, I'm happy to do some moderated questions. You want me to stay here? You want me to sit there?
Like that right now. Why don't you come sit and we'll slightly collegial chat for remaining about 10 minutes here. So that was really fantastic way to set the scene on the U.S. understands what China thinks about in terms of its interests, some of the key. And as you noted, the project that we're reviewing here today, hearing some of the findings of, really tried to approach a diverse range of understanding China's interests in both tangible and intangible spaces, and how that affects its interactions with those on its immediate periphery and a little bit further abroad. So I'd like to hear a little bit from you. You spoke a little bit about economic coercion, some of the areas of tension and potential flashpoints, for example, in the South China Sea. So how, given our understanding, as we've explored it, of Beijing's interests in creating kind of the spheres of influence, how is China's interests informing how it engages with, in particular, U.S. Allies or very strong partners in the Indo-Pacific? How do those interests shape how Beijing is interacting?
Let me talk about two separate things and answer that. One would be the traditional military, quasi-military sort of engagement that we've seen in China. Other talk about. Again, a sophisticated audience, our relationships with the countries in the border of the South China Sea is complex, as is China. When the PRC does something with any country that upsets peace and stability in the region, we have concerns. When they do things that upset the peace and stability with a treaty, we have real concerns that are different than just the concerns we have about peace and stability. This is a real challenge because the PRC has no treaty. And I would argue that one of the real strengths of our countries is our alliance. The NATO allies in Europe, the Rio Pact in Latin America, Korea, Japan, Australia, Philippines. It's unlike anything that the Chinese have ever seen. And for instance, in our talking about recent events in the South China Sea, we've taken great pains to talk to the Chinese in Beijing, or in Washington, elsewhere, to underscore, look, we honest to God do not want you to make up. You need to understand what a treaty alliance is. And sometimes words get in the way because the PRC's relationship with smaller countries is different. If you don't have that, those decades experience with a treaty ally, you maybe are dismissive of it. And I think you can see that in some of the popular literature that comes out of Beijing, where they kind of just assume away our alliance with the Philippines. On the economic front, I think that we're seeing a number of measures that the Chinese are taking to try to stabilize their facing some headwinds. It's a difficult time in many quarters of the PRC. One of the secrets to diplomacy, not so secret, is it's best to warn countries. It's best to have candid conversations with countries about steps you're going to take to protect your interests so that they don't mishandle it. And similarly on economic issues, far better that we're engaged in serious discussions with the PRC about these things. So that they may disagree with our decision, believe me, they often do, but at least they know that we're trying to do this and we're trying to give them heads up, we're trying to give them an opportunity. Because in my experience, at times, the PRC can course correct.
Great. So to pivot a little bit from allies to other countries that we struggle with at times, one of the conclusions in the report is that China's power expansion into the Indo-Pacific would really not have been possible, and is not possible without Russia's partnership, giving it really a secure rear area, making it feel secure in one space so that it can continue to pay attention to its interests further into the Indo-Pacific. So looking at the China-Russia relationship, where does the State Department see this relationship headed? And maybe from the U.S. perspective, how can we really counter that influence and that partnership at a regional and global level?
I would argue in that long list I went over of areas where challenges, the issue is China's support that's industrial base. Our analysis is pretty clear that China's provision of machine tools, China's provision of optics, of nitrocellulose, which is necessary for explosives, is keeping the Russian war machine working. We made that very, very clear to the Chinese, and we made it very, very clear to our European partners. We're talking regularly with NATO about this. The long and the short of it is, I think that China wants two things. It wants to have a deeper and economic relationship with Europe, while at the same time being the big supporter for the Russian war machine. And they have to be weighed off. They have to be, they have to understand and do both. And so I think it is gratifying that after we've done a number of measures aimed at going after Chinese companies that are providing a lot of this assistance, the Europeans have done similar things. I think one of the biggest successes of recent years has been the common worldview that you see among our partners in Asia Pacific and in Europe. If you recall, after Russia's invasion of Crimea, our friends and allies in Japan, in Korea, Australia, and elsewhere really didn't do well. After this invasion, though, however, you've seen the provision of people assistance, you've seen the provision of billions and billions of dollars of assistance, you've seen the diplomatic steps that countries have taken, is pretty impressive. And I think it is a manifestation of this understanding that what Russia has done is egregious. And today is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Tomorrow it will be something else in their neighborhood. So this view of looking at the stakes and trying to handle them in an appropriate way is issue number one. Now, getting to the core of this, remember in the lead up to the Beijing Summer Olympics, it was obvious that the relationship between President Xi and Vladimir Putin, deeply personal one. I think that continues. You look at the deference they pay to each other, the respect they show each other. In my experience, this is the average Chinese official that I've ever talked to, or the average Russian official I've spoken with, don't share this usually. I think though it is serious because it's at the moment.
Your comments are just raising so many additional follow-on questions that I wish I had time to ask, and I know our audience would love to have questions as well, but unfortunately, we have a really great panel of experts that are due on the stage 3 minutes ago. So I will pause there and try to be a good moderator, keep the time. So please join me in thanking Mark Lambert for his time.
We're done.
We're invite our panelists up to the stage.
Good afternoon. I'm Aaron Friedberg. I want to first introduce our speakers. Then I'm going to say just a word or two about the project, why I think it's so useful. To say a bit more, questions of each of the participants, and then, time permitting, try to take some questions from the audience. So first, let me just introduce people, starting with Nadej. Nadej Grelong is the Distinguished Fellow in China Studies at NBR. She was the primary investigator on this Mapping China's Strategic Space project. Her research focuses on China's foreign and defense policy and its grand strategy, articulation of China's vision for itself as a great power on the world stage. She's the author of a number of really outstanding works. Many of you will be aware of some of them. She's the author of China's Eurasian Century, Political and Strategic Implications of the Belt and Road Initiative, which came out in 2017. She's also written an outstanding monograph on China's strategic vision, other works. And she formerly served as an analyst and senior advisor on Asian and Chinese strategic issues to the French Ministry of Defense. Then to my right, Jacqueline Deal is the steering committee for this project, as I was. She's the president of the Long-Term Strategy Group, which is a defense consultancy. She's also co-founder of the American Academy for Strategic Education. Her work in recent years has focused on the new Cold War between the United States and China. She's written and testified in recent years about CCP's history, its military buildup, economic warfare. She's published in a range of outlets and journals. I want to call particular attention to this recent piece, at least I think it's the most recent, this journal, which came out just a few weeks ago, called Competing Analysis of Chinese Strategy. Finally, April Hurley is a senior research scientist at the Center for Naval Analyses, contributor to the Mapping China's Strategic Space project. She's an expert in China's foreign economic policy, economic statecraft, and she formerly served in the federal government, holding positions at the Department of Defense and also the U.S. Agency for International Development. She's written on a wide array of topics, including China's economic statecraft, its tech acquisition policies, special economic zones, and also a topic which I think is important but understudied, and that is tourism, the implications of tourism. So I encourage you to seek out her work. A few words about the project. I was very pleased, honored to be involved as a member of the steering committee. This project, I think, is another example as colleagues at NBR have been engaged in the last decade. A professor of mine used to describe this kind of work as policy relevant basic research. And the way in which this project has unfolded, its predecessors as well, has been to identify issues that are under discussion, in fact, by China's leadership and strategic elites, and not just sort of matching what we might think thinking about, but actually listening to what they're saying, and then using accessible but also underutilized Chinese language sources to map the contours of discussion over these issues and to trace their evolution over time. And this work, among other things, sheds light on a distinctive CCP process of analytical discourse that bears some resemblance to what goes on in free societies, but is different in important ways as well. For one thing, it's top-down. Topics are set, and the discussion is directed from the top leadership, and it's also not free-ranging. You don't have the full range of views that you might have similar debate in this country. In fact, it's constrained. The closed nature of the CCP system makes it impossible for outsiders to access its upper levels directly. But this method, I think, can provide important insight and also improve our ability to anticipate the broad direction of CCP policy. I often think of Plato's cave, the idea that you can't see directly the objects, but you can see the images that they project on the wall. I think that's the case with the kind of material that Nadesh and her colleagues have unearthed and have been exploiting. In my experience, this kind of work is very rare. It goes on in government, intelligence community, where people are occupied with current issues, and there's a tendency, I think, to believe that something doesn't have a big classification stamp on it, it's not worth read. Also, fortunately, it's quite rare in the academic world, where people, disillusioning anyone by revealing this, tend to be preoccupied with theoretical questions and theoretical data, sometimes to the exclusion of focus on things that are actually going on in the real world. So this kind of work takes distinctive skills, but also patience and resources. I want to commend Nadesh and her team, NBR also, and Carnegie Corporation for their willingness to support and sustain this kind of work over an extended period of time. So with that, Nadesh, I'm going to turn to you to introduce the project.
Production, it's very I wanted to say just maybe a few words of what this question comes from. What's the genesis of the project? And for the past decade, starting with what was then called One Belt One Road and the conception of the New World Order that China probably wants to do. And throughout this research, like this, closer here, like this. I'm just going to do it that way. Okay, thank you. And the basic question that came to my mind during that kind of research was, does this look on a map? Just, is there a way to just visualize it? Starting with Eurasia, which used to what Belt and Road covers, and then conception of a new world order, understanding that the global south is very important in that vision. So where does that go on a map? Just how can we? The other thing was we're talking a lot about Indo-Pacific, but in the Chinese language documents that I'm reading, the term Indo-Pacific only comes up when the researchers are talking about US or Western strategies. They continue to use the term Asian. They continue to use the term Asia or Asia Pacific. They talked of this term strategic space or sometimes vital space, or that term periphery. And all these formulations to me were signals of sort of a geopolitical code that I needed to learn more about. So perhaps the conceptualization of a spatially defined sphere of interest. And the third question that came to my mind was, what are, if any, what are the underlying intellectual influences? Who are the geopoliticians in China who are thinking in space and thinking spatially? So the main takeaways that I personally have taken from this research, and again, maybe once you read the whole project and the various, not just the report, but also the essays from various contributors and listen to the podcast and watch the videos, you will have your own opinion about your own takeaways. But I thought I may share mine. I was in those discussions about expansion or expanded space to begin around perhaps 2010, which was the date in which China became the second world economy. More confident in its power, would start to look way behind or beyond its own region and frontiers. But really what struck me is that I kept tracing back those discussions. 1991, and then 19 effort to delineate the extension. I expected more disagreement among scholars in China who are talking about these issues, about the dimension of the space, but really when you do what we're trying to do at the end of the report, drawing a sort of a Venn diagram of what everybody's talking about, there's a lot of overlap. So it seems to all go in the same kinds of directions. I would spatial or territorial delineations as well. But what I found is it's much more multidimensional. And in particular, I was really struck by the significance of the ideological domain, which is conceived as also a domain, a space that is untangible, but that is also under contestation and is squeezed or pressured. Finally, I was expecting a limited influence types of frameworks because those geopolitical concepts are actually foreign. They are usually attached to the notion of imperialism. They are extremely toxic in terms of their implications. But what I found is that those concepts are central to those kinds of thinkers, especially as they seek to explain the behavior and grand strategy of the US. And so you find a lot of references to Spikeman and to the encirclement and containment strategies. A lot of discussions about how the US is actually compressing and squeezing the strategic space that China needs to grow and to survive. I have tried to think about a very short sentence to encapsulate what's the main takeaway from this work that we've done. And I have not found a very way to do it. So I'm going to give you one way that was given to me by a former US diplomat. I sent him the report, and I told him, can you read it to me and tell me as a practitioner, what's your reaction to this? And he did it very, very beautifully, I think. He said, holy cow. So I think that was a good reaction to have as a policymaker. I will leave it here for now.
Maybe I can start with you. You're about to begin a process of briefings going around all these busy technical people. And I will not rude enough to say, I don't have It's the bottom line. That's what they will be thinking. Have you thought about what the answer is? So what is the
sort of the question is complicated because, as you said in your introductory remarks, this is a sort of a basic research. So it's not a new theory, or it's not a thing. This is an exploration of discussions that have spanned over 40 years in various clusters inside of China. As far as we can see it from the outside, again, it's vast, but it's also very limited. It's just the things that we can see from here. Yes, several points about why is it important. The way that it is conceptualized, the strategic space is conceptualized. It is assumed to be inherently contested, and so there's little room for cooperation. It's more about competition, and especially in the domains that Beijing officially calls the strategic new frontiers or strategic new territories. I think April is going to talk about the Eurasian continent, and it's not just the Eurasian continent, but it's also its adjacent waters. At the It's not really a map, it's just an illustration, but it's Arctic down to Pacific, down to Indian Ocean, perhaps extending to the Atlantic Ocean. So what Mr. Lambert said earlier about the importance of in ocean, I would say yes, but it goes even beyond that. The linkage between, as Ali mentioned earlier, the linkage between the strategic space of China and Russia was also very prominent to me. All these discussions about expansion, maritime expansion, the necessity to strengthen the North and consolidate that greater area was quite visible. So it's a discussion that is still ongoing. So this is not a finite solution or discussion of what this means. And I was perhaps expecting more about, okay, so what does it look like? Seem to want to have a certain degree of, I might even say control, because I'm not sure whether this is really at stake here. It's a secure space, right? And in all dimensions, from the deep sea to the outer space to the ideology. So in the 21st century context, the way that this is going to translate in concrete terms might not be the same way it did before in history. Realism or full prosperity sphere, things like that, might take a different shape. And this is the question mark that I still have about to discover.
That all seem to assume that there's a contest for space is contested. You say a little more about what you infer from reading this material.
Is a zero sum, and it's stems from this idea that the space is limited, and that the state is an organism that needs space to. And so if you have that space or control over that space, that means that I don't have. So it's a zero sum description. It's highly contested.
The United States, is that?
Yes. I should have said that on the onset. It's really the main preoccupation here is the hegemony of the U.S. actually squeezing and pressuring that space, whether it's in the form of a military encirclement, of an ideological containment, or of an economic suppression.
You find Chinese writers looking at other examples, historical examples, looking at the United States, looking at their own history?
All the time. So that's also something that I really found very, because there is a, especially the decade around 2000 up to 2010, when there's some intense work that's being done on the rise and fall of powers and mistakes and successes that those past powers have met. That's also something that I think they're learning from. I have a full paragraph on a particular paper that I find super interesting about women in Germany and that could be parallels are so interesting. The author himself makes those parallels without really citing China per se, but you will see in very important. It's implicit, but it's right.
So that's a story that doesn't have a very happy ending. I think I could close reader. So I wonder if you could this issue.
First of all, thank you very much for the generous introduction, and I just want to take the time to thank NDR and the team, and especially Nadej for including me in the steering committee. It's been an honor to pitch in. And I think this report bears close reading and study, and so I will just try to summarize some of the findings on the military dimensions of strategic space, but I can't do justice in a minute or two. But what Nadej surfaces is the importance of a set of conversations, as she said, that started really to go back to the 1980s, which was a time of ferment and thinking among Chinese strategists, geopolitics and technology. And part of the discussion at this time had to do with opportunities for as a result of new technologies coming online. But there was a seminal TLA Daily article, think piece, that was written by a senior colonel in 1987, published in 1987, that said basically there are big countries and small countries, to anticipate an infamous statement from 2010. But the article basically is about strategic frontiers or boundaries. And the idea is small countries can't even police their own borders or defend their own territories, whereas big countries exert influence well beyond their formal or legal boundaries. China, the article goes on to say, is going to have to be one of those big countries for a range of reasons having to do with economic, resource, market access pressures, and kind of the technological factors and the way warfare is headed and the emergence of these new domains. So all the way back in 1987, a senior colonel who would go on to become a general is making the case for the PRC and therefore the PLA to be able to exert influence well beyond the PRC's legal borders. And then Nadej picks up the thread in 2013, a seminal publication from the Academy of Military Science in Beijing comes out, the 2013 edition of the Science of Strategy or Military Strategy. And it explicitly says, we need more strategic space. We're going to have to be more influential in space and cyber, as well as the maritime sphere. We're going to have influence in the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, but also littoral regions across Asia, Africa, Oceania, North America, South America, Antarctica, and others, which is pretty comprehensive. And I think the estimate at that time in the text is roughly 50% of the globe is going to have to be an area where we exert influence or can claim or project our strategic space. And I should have mentioned earlier, just on the theme of kind of historical references, that 1987 Daily Daily article that Nadej cites itself cites the precedents of Genghis Khan and the British Empire. So as Nadej explains, these are overland or terrestrial empires and maritime empires that are whose past examples are informing the thinking on what aid countries do. So I think, you know, the holy cow response is warranted when you think about the depth, the decades of thinking that have gone out and underpin what we're now seeing in the way of PLA investments in expeditionary or power projection capabilities.
Is it fair to say that Chinese strategic writers have been envisioning a space that has been expanding as their power has grown?
Well, I think it's interesting that even before their power had grown, they were anticipating in a kind of very ambitious way this moment. And yes, I think you know, tracking the writings as Nadesh has done shows that even using open sources or limited to kind of remotely accessible. So I think just, you know, in terms of the pioneering methodology that Nadesh has been pursuing for work at NPR, I think it's very important to recognize, contrary to maybe some recent complaints about the difficulties of doing research or policy relevant basic research, the space is there for very important landmark groundbreaking work like this study. And I think, you know, what we learned from this piece is the PLA's inroads or expansion, pushing into what have been considered the global commons or territorial space, again, has deep roots or has been a long time coming, has been well thought out or substantially thought out. It's not fruit of some move that was, you know, a decision that came this administration or last administration. It's not as action. I think you can tell that as Nadesh said, there's kind of a direction of the thinking that maps onto or tracks with the behavior, and we can observe that.
This is a difficult question, but as you know, there is a school of thought that holds that much of China's foreign policy behavior, military policy behavior, is in some sense defensive, that it's motivated by concerns of threats that are posed primarily by the United States, but by U.S. friends and allies. How do you assess those?
Well, I guess the report handles this by saying it's difficult to separate these kind of defensive impulses from the more expansionist impulses when you think of the going in worldview in the late 1980s as we're going to need to exert more influence based on our requirement for resources, access to markets, the trends in technology and warfare is going even before anybody had impinged on, or while the United States saw itself as protecting global commons, it's hard to say that that was defensive in the sense of a reaction to some offense. But is it defensive? Or maybe, I mean, the term almost loses its meaning in this context. Or I think it may be a mistake to focus too much on that it come from defense offense when it's kind of, as Nadesh explained, kind of so ingrained, so built in to the world important decision makers.
So if I could continue with you, say on new frontiers, and one reason, in some sense, Chinese strategists realized that most of physical space has been divided up. Redraw the map in that sense with a few limited exceptions, but that there are all these other new domains, some of which are physical and some of which are not, where it may also be important to exert influence and have control. Can you talk a little bit about your findings regarding the undersea?
Absolutely. And I do want to also echo Jackie's comments about thanking MBR for including me in this project. And I want to thank Nadesh for asking thought-provoking questions, because I really do think this issue of new strategic frontiers is going to shape global international relations for the next several decades. My contribution to this project has been analysis of the intersection of digital infrastructure in the undersea domain. There's actually many dimensions of that. Typically, the digital infrastructure is under the cyberspace domain, that's what it's considered. And you could think of undersea as part of the maritime domain, but what I argue in the essay is there are new dimensions because of the way China is conceptualizing the deep sea. So both of these domains represent an expanding strategic space, and there are physical elements to each of them, but there are also these imagined intangible elements to both of these domains. So the digital Silk Road creates opportunities and risks for national security, data, privacy. Undersea exploration has a range of implications for oceanographic surveillance, the rights of states with large exclusive economic zones, and the environment. Because there's actually so much that could be explored further in these two different domains, in the paper itself, I examined 3 main intersections. I looked at submarine fiber optic cables, mapping of the seabed floor, and deep sea mining. Also, kudos to the map maker for this project, Louis, because he did an amazing job of sort of like mapping out some of these subsea cables, because that's actually a space that also is a bit, I would say it's getting more attention now, but it's not always understood because some of these projects, while they involve physical infrastructure, you don't actually know where they are. A lot of this is industry specific information and I'd rather not share it. So to give sort of a flavor of what China is doing, though, I do want to quote from the Belt and Road Action Plan, which stated that China should, quote, build bilateral cross-border optical cable networks at a quicker pace, plan transcontinental submarine optical cable projects. And what I want to note with that is clearly the BRI is trying to take sort of responsibility for this dimension for the digital infrastructure. But while the digital Silk Road, I think, is a clever branding strategy, most of the projects in digital infrastructure happened before that was a strategy. So my take on that is that these Chinese firms were out there doing what they were going to do. They were laying cables and taking on these projects, and then the Chinese government sort of wanted to claim credit for some of it. So it was this idea that firms were just doing what firms do to make money, and then we can conveniently layer on these other things. And what I loved about the report in this project is bringing all that together, because these weren't new ideas. But it takes time in the Chinese government to get to the space where you actually have a strategy, where you have a policy. And another area that's really interesting in terms of the digital Silk Road is a complicated relationship with the party, the Chinese government, and private sector firms. Because over the last few years, that has been fraught with tension. The other thing I did want to mention about the mapping the seabed floor is you need to have an understanding of the seabed floor for both deep sea mining and for laying cables. But there's also a lot of discussions of new technology areas, this idea of cooling centers, because sort of server farms produce so much heat, there's actually been this growing body of research and from Chinese scholars in Chinese language materials saying, maybe we put it on the seabed floor. I mean, would that help with the cooling? Now, this is technology, we're not there yet, this is off into the future, but I think when we think about new strategic frontiers, we do have to think about those, and that's where there's these really interesting connections between the digital and cyberspace and things like the undersea. And I'll just close with this sort of, as it relates to international institutions, and I bring up the deep sea mining, because Pacific Island countries are very concerned about the direction that might go. Most of those countries don't have the capacity to do it themselves, so they would want to bring in external firms. And those negotiations and debates are happening right now in the International Seabed Authority.
So in those domains with regard, do you find the writers who you looked at talking about threats, opportunities that they have to seize? Is there some sense of urgency?
I would say in the case of the deep sea mining, there's not so much a sense of urgency. Well, I've seen this until advanced semiconductor export controls from the US. So US-China competition, the competition over critical minerals, that has sort of created, I think, a sense of urgency. I think I did have this in my notes. Yeah, it was in July 2023, China passed a series of export controls on gallium and germanium, which are critical minerals used in high-end semiconductors, advanced radars, 5G-based towers, and fiber optic systems. So there is now this concern over the technology policies that maybe they need to either grow it indigenously or move more quickly. I think the deep sea mining is still a little bit into our future, but you need all of those things to do the sort of mapping of the seabed floor. And they've already put together a monitoring system in the South China Sea, and the writings that are reviewed for this project, they are looking at expanding that out further beyond the South China Sea. So that's something theoretically you might want to do to understand the environmental conditions and the bathymetry that you'd need to do mining in the future.
Is there, are there aspects of international law that are relevant to the question of who controls or who can exploit sources?
Those are the issues that I think are right now being debated. It is not exactly clear, and I'm not a legal scholar, so I won't get into UNCLOS, and I'll leave that to the legal scholars, but there are serious questions about who controls the rights to the seabed floor and how much control do states with large exclusive economic zones have to controlling activities that take place when that. Could they monitor it? Do they need permits? And those discussions right now are happening in International Seabed Authority. And my concern for U.S. policy is we don't have people in the room being part of those discussions. And so now you've got countries they're going to look to the big countries that have the technology to do it, and then they might drive how the policy turns out in terms of how it's managed. Now, to be fair to the Pacific Island countries, their big concern is also environmental. Because they don't think the environmental implications of deep sea mining are understood well enough that we're ready to move forward. But those debates are being had.
I just want to come back to you. I don't know what, I think we're going to microphone here and ask their questions if they like. Two questions. One, do you see evidence of new discussion emerging part of Chinese writers, or any indications that they are thinking that perhaps their early ideas about this were overly ambitious, and maybe they're going to have to their horns a little bit, either because of resistance from others or because of limitations on their sources?
Actually, something that it's an ongoing discussion. So the things that happened started to have this very expensive vision coincides with the moment when China's power is really at the top, really almost at the top, and sort of projecting themselves in this imagined mental map of what it could look like. And so, as with this historian who sort of cautioned about William Germany's example, there are some scholars and planners who are also cautioning about the possibility of overextension, even as China has not really reached that point where it exerts control over that vast extent. So there's a lot of discussion about overextension, and these are actually drawn from all these historical examples of things that mistakes that those rising powers have made in the past. So again, it's you will see in the report, I almost never use the term empire because and we sort of project an idea or a vision of what empire based on what it looked like in the past. This is going to be something necessarily different, because how in the 21st century can you exert control the same way that the Europeans did over its now? So I think there with discussions today about China's slowdown of its economy, and if that discussion used to be aligned with this trust and confidence in their growth and power, what does happen if and when they believe that or even about to be? There are two ways that they could go about that. One is shrinking the mental map, and perhaps just refocusing on the border regions, or way would be to perhaps think about those intangible spaces and not really fully exert control of military control over those areas. The key here that I found towards the end, because these are discussions that are happening more now, more recently, so we'll see more about that, I think, in the next few years. But it's not so much really what is more important than China's self-confidence about its own power. It's its own power relative to that of the US. And so it happened at the time when China thought it was really rapidly growing and started to see the US as slowly declining. And are less confident about their own ability to continue to grow as their economy. Calculation of the gap that it's shrinking with the US power because they continue to see that the US is in accelerated decline. And so the projections about China's comprehensive national power overtaking the US a few years ago were optimistic, and today might have been the year where they had anticipated overtaking the US. Now they're sort of pushing that date further down the line. It's not a question of whether they believe that they're going to.
This is an area where this kind of system has limitations. In the United States, there's been a debate, discussion of overextension that's been going on for 50 years. It's still going on today. But to discuss that in the Chinese context, I would think would be sensitive because it would require acknowledging that there have been mistakes. We like nothing more than to adulate ourselves about our past mistakes, but I imagine that's a trickier position in your system. One last question then. So what's next? What are the areas for further research that have come out of this?
Well, one of the things that really appeared in recent years is this question of talking about there is more something similar or akin to a realm rather than, your broad or something that resembles a. And if that realm is more in terms of influence rather than sheer physical control. I think one particular discussion that we need to pay attention to is this idea of civilization. Xi Jinping, there's more and more discussion about this idea of portraying various civilizations as being equal. And putting just that term out there, the Global Civilization Initiative, is also a marker of this perhaps continued expanded map, but that goes into the ideological realm. I don't have any answer again about what shape does it take, but I'm just monitoring the again, the geopolitical code, and this is a formulation that seems to appear more often in the official. Direction that I might want to take in the next few years.
Actually, I had a suggestion. I don't know if there's someone in from NDR who do this, that rather than have people jumping up and down, maybe you put up your hand. Someone could just take the mic and take this one, either starting colleague Jim Mann.
I'm Jim Mann, author. You guys get the question that I would have asked Mark Lambert. Also affects space in the sense that you spoke of the entire company. Does the pursuit of dialogue for its own sake undercut the United States position in China? In my experience, China doesn't, and it's not to just say, oh, good, that's a great idea, let's talk. They tend to ask for things. So it appears that the United States got help on fentanyl in exchange for, well, we're not sure, all of the dialogues. But what do you think of the pursuit of dialogues?
Specifically, if I can twist it a little bit to make it connected. Sometimes argue that there's a reason for dialogue, for example, the nuclear issues, because you need to understand how. Is there the possibility of gaining a better understanding of China's conceptions of strategic space for dialogue?
Wish someone could always remember back to the having left government 10 years ago, pursuit of dialogue is just a necessity. It's a natural thing to do as part of your policy. But I would say you go into a dialogue knowing what to expect of what their revenues are and what their interests truly are. And so I guess the work that we're trying to do with in think tanks is to actually help the diplomats and officials to actually understand that beyond what their counterparts are telling them, and trying to sense of what is going on in the minds of their counterpart when they're at the table. Show stance and be very orchestrated, protocolar, propaganda.
I'm Sheridan Cosso. I work for Bloomberg. I'd like to understand a little bit more about the ideological origin stories of this, because you mentioned technology, but at that time, I mean, does it have to do with strength of the Soviet Union in that period? We hadn't yet had to follow the Berlin Wall. We hadn't had the threats to Chinese leadership as we did in 1989. So is there some sort of origin that we can look at? And so maybe it goes back to what Nadej was just saying about the importance of relative power, because in the 1980s, Chinese strategists were actually anticipating the two major superpowers were going to kind of mutually bankrupt each other. And therefore, there was going to be an opportunity. And more terrible was the United States was showing that through what the Russian Soviets were calling the military evil revolution, there was the possibility of using conventional weapons because of advances in microprocessing and the shrinking of information technology. And you could use missiles to create accurate effects conventionally, so you could do damage that previously you would only had to only do with much less precise nuclear weapons. And so I think Chinese strategists were looking at about the military technical revolution, that they said the United States was enacting or executing, and they were thinking this is a huge opportunity because it's another term in this era is a revolution in military affairs. So it's a revolution, and we're the newcomers. We don't have the inertia that the established superpowers have. So we're going to be able to take advantage of these new possibilities enabled by technology and apply them, and our organizations, our military is less. We can be more nimble in forming the right organizations and developing the new doctrines. And at the same time, there was recognition that a lot of the information technology that was essential to this achievement with conventional munitions could only previously be achieved with that a lot of the information technology behind it was dual use are going to be available commercially. And so there was just a lot of very ambitious writing by literally MPLA daily that you can go back and see still. At this time where, if you think about it, China was incredibly distant, and it's PLA, the party army was in the midst of beginning to transform away from people who were really just beginning, really. So not even fully recognized, but just very clearly their sense of there's in the environment favor us, and we're going to be able to leapfrog, another term that is used. So we have to under these conditions, with superpowers continuing to kind of spend and go at each other, and these new technologies coming online that are evolutionary. This is our moment. I think that's part of the intellectual context in which you're currently writing, and also there was this anticipation of the way they put it was, but notwithstanding that, or even so, as the population gets wealthier, and we industrialize, we're going to need to take in more resources from the rest of the world. We're not going to be able to provide enough food. We don't have enough arable land. We're going to need more and more raw materials. So part of the thinking was our strategic space requirements will increase. We're going to have to influence well beyond our formal boundaries because of these economic factors that are going to increasingly come into play as we move up the food chain economically. I think that was also part of the inspiration.
And is that around that time, before when the Soviet Union collapses, this is the shift, because the main enemy has disappeared, but immediately as this main Soviet enemy, Soviet threat has disappeared, there's a new threat. This position has to face. And the other thing is sort of another way to term it is sort of a manifest destiny. China, as Jackie said in her discussion earlier, in the sense that China is going to become, and as inevitable it is that China is going to become that great power, reaction, pushback, tension is also going to be inevitable. So it's that double inclusion. This is the way it's going to be. Big powers are going to be big powers, and tension and conflict is going to be. The question then becomes, how do we manage them? History gives us a partial answer to that question.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn Joanne Chen from Taiwan. And first, congratulate for the final publication on mapping China strategic space. And China is trying to create new strategic frontiers in terms of 3 dimensions: the space, deep sea, and the polar region. Which one you think they gain the most space? And which one they get the most backlash, united from country concerned in order to keep peace and stability of this world? Thank you.
I'll talk about that. I think in the short term and the near term, the outer space realm provides a lot more space in terms of how you operate, both as the PLA, but also the emerging technologies. I mean, obviously there's a lot. My colleague, Kevin Mulvier, writes on space a lot, and I've read a lot of his work. So I think right now today, that's really a frontier that's already been realized and will expand. I think the deep sea is, we're looking at a decade. I think there are opportunities there. There is a lot of Chinese writings about operating in the deep sea. They've done scientific exploration missions in the deep sea. So I think that is something to watch, but it doesn't offer much yet. But I think over the next several decades, we're going to see that being expanded strategic space. And I would have to defer to other colleagues about the polar regions because I don't think that is.
And in those like strategic frontiers that may are again best as a dimension of like physical control, but we need to make sure that we understand the like, to these are considered global commons. They are legal scholar, but this is a domain where I think Beijing believes that they can be the first mover in establishing a set of rules in order to actually spaces the exploitation and exploration of those spaces.
I want to thank all of you for being here. Our attendance for this excellent work. I don't know if there are copies available, but I encourage you to pick them up. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Thank you.